21st of 62, but this was 1961. So, in other words, it was, I won't go into how insane it might seem for a 30-year-old to be doing that, but I can tell you that with all my reservations about that plan now, which are extreme, it was a lot better than the one I was replacing, which was in effect in 1961, 1960, left over from Eisenhower. And I say all that simply to say that that put me in a position to have a question of mine, which I'd actually drafted for the Secretary of Defense, picked up by Robert Comer, who was the deputy to McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Assistant to John Kennedy, to be sent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the name of the President, Jack Kennedy. And the question was, if your plans, this is the Eisenhower PSYOP, if your plans were carried out as planned, meaning not interfered with, they weren't a total bust, they did what they were supposed to do, how many people would die in the Soviet Union and China? And it was my impression at that time, which turned out to be mistaken, that the Joint Chiefs had never calculated that. They'd calculated how many cities would be destroyed, how many air bases, how many missile sites, if any. There was one at that time in the Soviet Union with 4 missiles on it. But that wasn't the assumption at the beginning of 61. The assumption was that they were ahead of us in missiles. That was the missile gap period. So if they calculated all that and how many planes we would lose to anti-aircraft and surface-air missiles and so forth, but not, I thought, how many would die, and I wanted to bring that out for the President to see. Well, it turned out, and the reason I said only the Soviet Union and China, although we believed then there was the Soviet Warsaw Pact we were facing, I didn't ask for that, because I thought that if they hadn't calculated it, they would not want to admit that to the President, and they would say, give us a couple of weeks here to calculate for Albania or Outer Mongolia or somewhere, we don't have that. And I said, just the Soviet Union and China, you must have that, right? Which I thought they didn't, but I was wrong. Within days, they came back with an answer, top secret, sensitive, eyes only for the President. And I didn't see very many, that may have been the only thing I ever saw. There was eyes only for the President, meaning not to be shown to anybody else. But since I had written the question, they did show it to me. It was the form of a graph, simple graph with a line drawing. I don't have it here. Blackboard here. But on the horizontal axis was time from zero, the moment of execution, to month by month for 6 months. And then the upper axis, vertical axis, was deaths in millions. And it was just a line starting lower and rising over 6 months as deaths increased from fallout. As you know, in Hiroshima, I think some 58,000 perhaps, maybe, no, it might have been 80,000 were killed immediately, but over time, of course, virtually another 100,000 died. And within a few months, tens of thousands more died. So the question was then, how many right away? What would your guess be, let me ask, since it's a small audience. If we'd been filled here, I wouldn't go through this. But let me do a little quiz here. What do you think the starting number was for deaths, immediate deaths? 10 million? Well, actually, it was higher, but what? Any other guesses? What? 25 million. Okay, a third? It's actually higher than that. What? 40 million, yeah. It was 275 million. And that rose in 6 months to 325 million. In other words, the fallout that they calculated in the Soviet Union and China alone was more than I heard here as an estimate. It was another 50 million. I heard here 10, 25, 40. And frankly, I've asked this question many times over 40 years here, and those are the usual estimates that I hear. Now, if you think about it, 10 million is not a reflective figure, very much. Moscow alone, or Moscow and St. Petersburg, would give you 10 million, right? if you're hitting cities. But what they told the president was 325 million. So they did have an answer to that, to my surprise. So obviously they had the calculations. It was a simple graph. It was a straight line, as I say, over time. So I said, okay, obviously they know the rest of the answers. So we sent them down another question. How many altogether from our strikes alone? No, not the Soviet response, if any. And within a week, we had this time not a graph, but a table showing another 100 million in East Europe, the captive nations, as they were called in the Eisenhower period, the satellites. We were going to kill 100 million people there, partly from largely from fallout and fire, but a lot of actual warheads exploding on air defenses. In theory, we didn't go after cities in East Europe. We hit every city over 100,000 in Russia, every city. But we didn't target cities per se in East Europe, as, by the way, interestingly, I'll just jump ahead here, in a recent exercise, Russia, with the knowledge of NATO listening in, targeted Warsaw. Now, it's no longer in the Warsaw Pact. There's no Warsaw Pact anymore. So Warsaw is now a target for Russian cities. Well, it didn't used to be a target for U.S., but it would all die anyway from fallout because we're hitting air defenses and radar stations and communications links and command headquarters and so forth. That's 100 million. Another 100 million in West Europe, our NATO allies, from fallout from our attacks, depending on, quote, which way the wind blows, as was testified to Congress, which depended largely on the season, whether the winds were blowing generally east or west. So it might not be that many, but it might be 100 million. Definitely another 100 million in areas contiguous to the Soviet Union or China, such as Afghanistan, a place I couldn't have found on the map then until relatively recently in my life. Japan, Japan. Northern India, Austria, neutral country. Finland, neutral country. Wiped out. Finland, for example, wiped out by the fallout from our attacks, ground bursts, on submarine pens in Leningrad, near Leningrad. So the total was about 600 million. 100 holocausts. And this was what the Joint Chiefs were saying, without apology to the president, would be the effect if, as in the Berlin crisis that year, or the Cuban Missile Crisis the next year, 62, we carried out these plans. So I thought of them as the most evil plans that had ever existed in the history of humanity, and that these were pieces of paper that I had in my hand that should not exist. They shouldn't refer to anything real, but they really did. These were not hypothetical Herman Kahn-type plans about World War XI in the future somehow. These were our plans for operational crises this year. Like the Ukraine crisis, you can be sure that there are plans like this, actually, right now, on both sides going on. Meaning that in this very informed group that I'm looking at here, right, is it unfair for me to infer from the answers I just got? It's really not easy for you to imagine human bureaucrats, Americans, civilian or military, and Eisenhower had been military, of course, the highest level, but was now a civilian, been elected twice, didn't like the plan, but he didn't change it. And he passed it on to Kennedy unchanged, and that's what I was seeing at this point. Hard to imagine. Okay, let me take a leap back. How did we get to that? Let me say, try to do it quickly in these terms. I said earlier, 1950, the HBomb, we've just gone into a crash program of the HBomb. Truman had announced, although it wasn't clear at that point that it was actually feasible, that it would be feasible. It wasn't really clear for another 15 months or so after that, into 1952, roughly. 51. And that it was feasible, but he was going to try to see if he could do it. The man pushing it mainly, and who had been doing so from the beginning of the Manhattan Project, another story I could go back to of interest, but was Edward Teller, later known as the father of the H-bomb, big fraternity suit he had with Stan Ulam as to which one had the crucial insight here or not, and Teller was very jealous of that, but Teller wanted his to be known as the father of the H-bomb. As Andrei Sakharov, a couple of years later, in Russia, was the father of the Soviet H-bomb. And in 1950, they had announced this process, and Leo Szilard, who had been a key figure in the Manhattan Project and before the Manhattan Project, very interesting history here, could go into. But anyway, Leo Szilard was very knowledgeable on this stuff, who had been against testing the A-bomb at the Trinity test in 1945, along with a dozen other of his associates at the University of Chicago, part of the Manhattan Project. Or, if it couldn't stop the test, against dropping it on Japan, even if it would save American lives, because they knew something that actually I don't think Truman ever did know until he heard about it in 1950, 5 years later. And that was that the A-bomb was potentially the trigger to an H-bomb. Now, knowledge among the American public, I found in audiences as to the difference between an A and an H-bomb changes over, it goes up and down, generally very low. There have been times when it was well known. But how many people here, I'm just asking how many, raise your hands, feel you know pretty well the difference between an A-bomb and an H-bomb? An A-bomb and H-bomb, I see 5 or 6. How many honestly then don't? Okay, thanks, that's about right. I mean, that's what I would figure. And really over the years, say going back before a Physicians for Social Responsibility campaign in the 80s, almost nobody knew that. There would be 1 or 2 in an audience who would say they knew the difference. All right, I'll give it to you. Somebody said, what is the difference? Magnitude, yeah, which is larger? What? Yeah, right, very good. As he says, the H-bomb is 1,000 times more powerful than the A-bomb. And a way to feel that, to understand, in 1950, we only had A-bombs of the kind, uranium type that destroyed Hiroshima, plutonium implosion type that destroyed Nagasaki 3 days later. Okay, those are A-bombs. That was the A-bomb area. Atomic bomb, they were called. Fission bombs. And to give you a sense of what the difference is, I think the best way simply to say it is this. Every H-bomb, hydrogen, H is for hydrogen, it's the fusion of light elements, fusion of hydrogen elements to release energy. The A-bomb is the fission, mainly of uranium, but also plutonium, which releases energy, splitting of the atom. The fusion is the opposite. It's what generates the energy of the sun, the fusion. And that can be, and a good figure is 1,000 times, but the way to see it is every H-bomb and virtually all of our still 5,000 or so weapons, used to be 10,000. There was a time when it was 30,000 in the U.S. weapons. Nearly all H-bombs, thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen weapons, not all that big, but every one of them required a Nagasaki-type bomb as its trigger. Everyone has as a detonator a Nagasaki-type bomb. And as I say, the H-bomb then that it triggers can go not only 1,000 times more, it can go 2,000 or 10,000. There's actually no limit. It can go any amount. But the early bomb, now, the A-bomb was 1,000 times the largest explosive power of World War II. They were called blockbusters, and they were between 10 and 20 tons of TNT. Nobel's, the ultimate, Alfred Nobel's dynamite, high explosive. They would level a city block. That's why they were called blockbusters. Actually, some of you are old enough to remember. Who remembers that? Blockbusters in World War II. A couple people. I was 14 when the war ended. I remember that very well. Okay, the first A-bomb in Hiroshima then was, you hear the figures change over time a little bit, but it's about 13 and a half, but say 15 kilotons, 1,000 tons equivalent of TNT. So that's 1,000 times the blockbuster. The first explosion of an actual bomb type, that was a device in 52, but the first explosion of a bomb type, hydrogen bomb, in 54, was 15 megatons, 15 million tons, 1,000 times Hiroshima, or 1 million times World War II. Okay? Now, what people like Szilard and others, actually everybody in the Manhattan Project knew, was that the A-bomb would only, which the A-bomb was going probably to be the trigger of an H-bomb eventually. And that they always saw, all the scientists understood, could end humanity some way. Too big, very big. So people who had been in charge of the A-bomb project, a number of them like Oppenheimer and Conant, my professor at Harvard, and who was at the same time president of Harvard when I was an undergraduate, was head over Oppenheimer in the A-bomb program, were very, very strongly against there being a crash program or the existence of an H-bomb. They had recommended against it. It's one of the few times in history where scientists actually told policymakers, don't go there, don't do this. Try to achieve, some of them said, Fermi and Rabi, an agreement with the Soviets not to do this. And in no first test agreement would have been very easy to monitor. The fission bomb tests provide some problems because if they're done underground, they can look very small, they can look like earthquakes, it can be a little hard to, though not impossible, to monitor them. But an H-bomb test in the atmosphere, no problem. So they could have had a no first test agreement, but no, and that was recommended to Eisenhower, and then, I'm sorry, to Truman, and then to Eisenhower, but no, they didn't go there. The effect of that, I'm going to jump up on history here. The effect was this. The early nuclear war plans of the U.S. envisioned doing with A-bombs, that's all they had then, to Russian cities what we had done to Japanese cities. And I'm not talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm talking about what we started to do on the night of March 9th and 10th in Tokyo, where, if any of you heard me earlier today, I mentioned, little known in the minds of Americans, the largest act of terrorism to this day in human history was conducted by American strategic bombers, a little over 300 of them, dropping fire bombs on Tokyo, creating a firestorm, which is not an ordinary fire. It's a fire that simultaneously creates so many individual fires that they meld together into a coherent mass. They create a great updraft of air, hot air, which brings in cold air from surrounding, creates its own weather in effect, and creates hurricane-scale winds that come into this vacuum, relatively low pressure area that's created, a further updraft. So it's like a bellows in a furnace. And the smoke actually from that goes into the stratosphere, which doesn't happen with an ordinary fire, like the fires that Saddam Hussein lit of all the, if you remember in Iraq, as far as you can see, burning and smoke. But it's not a firestorm. There wasn't enough fuel. There wasn't enough tinder. It's in the desert. So it didn't go into the stratosphere. It didn't create a firestorm or go into the stratosphere, and that makes a difference, which I'll mention in a minute. But this was a firestorm. There had been 2 earlier firestorms in the war, although our bombers and RAF had tried to make a firestorm every time. But it's hard to do. It depends on the weather and the type of kindling. And they had only succeeded in doing it in Hamburg in 1943 and in Dresden. There were actually 2 small ones, I think, in Muttlangen, very small. But Hamburg, Dresden, and then Dresden was in, I think, February of 1945. And then a few weeks after it, in Japan, Tokyo, the biggest one, killed 80 to 120,000 people in one night. That's not counting the fire victims who died afterwards, in one night. And they died because of this firestorm. Essentially everybody within the, actually the one in Tokyo is what's a little different, called a sweep conflagration, but it's driven by winds. It moves rather than being one area. It moves, and it generates temperatures so high that it destroys all the oxygen in the shelters, so people who are in shelters all suffocated. It lit the asphalt streets on fire. They were melted, the asphalt was melting and burning. So people who left the shelters, and this was a deliberate effect, but this was a success. They tried to do this everywhere. People who left the shelters then found themselves embroiled, stuck in the burning asphalt and burned like candles in the asphalt because they couldn't move. But some of them who got through that and into the canals that crisscross Tokyo, like Venice almost has a lot of canals, boiled to death because the canals were boiling. And tens of thousands boiled to death in Tokyo. So as I say, the total between 80 and 120,000 dead. And that was regarded by General LeMay, who was in charge of that operation, Thomas Power leading the flight under him. Power succeeded LeMay later as the commander of Strategic Air Command, regarded as, if you look at his memoirs, the greatest success, of a military operation, in history. Bigger, he says, bigger than the San Francisco fire, bigger than the Tokyo fire of 1923, bigger than the London fire, earlier, and so forth. Really big. And so they proceeded to use the same tactics on the next 64 Japanese cities in order of population. But they didn't kill as many people because a lot of people had been evacuated and the weather wasn't quite right, and they didn't really get it. They never actually got maybe one little one, firestorm. They only killed another 700,000 or 800,000 people for a total of 900,000 civilians before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Or, to put it another way, then you add 300,000 from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not in 2 nights, but over months. So you get about 1.2 million people there. 600,000 German civilians had been killed. Civilians. So that's 1.8. That's about as many people who went through Auschwitz. And they didn't die better than the people in Auschwitz. Being burned to death in fallen timbers is not a better way to die, not a better way to die than gasping for breath in a gas chamber. We did that. We were killing as many civilians as we could, and that meant that Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not present themselves to Truman as a moral issue at all. And people have asked ever since, well, how could he have done that? And how could he have done number 2 after doing number 1 and so forth? There was no issue, there was no moral issue at all. As Truman said, he said, I never lost a night's sleep. How could he? All that meant was doing with one bomb very efficiently in one plane what it otherwise took 300 to do. But we had 300, and we're using them night after night, and we've been doing it for 5 months, starting under Franklin D. Roosevelt, sainted man in my family, and a lot of other families. But this started under Roosevelt. And we've been doing it for 5 months, killing as many people as possible. It's genocide in wartime. Killing them because they were Japanese for no other reason. Well, we're killing them in order to end the war, yes, for a purpose. Well, Hitler had a purpose too, to make Western Europe, or make Europe Judenfrei, free of Jews, purify the race and so on. He had higher purposes. And we had, our purpose was ending the war. It didn't do it, actually, by the way, but that's another story. Okay. The atom bomb then comes along as the simple instrument for carrying out this same kind of bombing program, which LeMay had concluded was the way you fight a war. He'd been doing it now for 5 months, and the war ended. So Russian cities were named as targets. If you look at the war plan, it doesn't specify coordinates, or they're declassified now, the early war plans. It doesn't say bomb factory here, base there, port there. It says Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Kharkov. You know, those are the targets to be wiped out. Now that was under Truman. What happened was, I found when I was writing the war plan in 1961, I looked at the earlier guidance through the 50s, and what I found was that the predicted deaths from carrying out our operations were at first unrealistically small, it seemed to me, for A-bombs, even for A-bombs. 10 million? Come on, how can you have a war? How can you do this and have only 10 million? That's why I got the feeling that they always underestimated everything, see, and I expected estimates like the ones you're telling, stupid underestimates. But no, they knew better by that time. They were still underestimating, by the way. Okay, so then they go up to 15 million, 20 million, into the mid-50s. And then all of a sudden, 150 million, 200 million, 275 million. What the hell? What happened? Did they just get more dangerous? What happened? Do we have more A-bombs? Well, we did have more A-bombs, and that does the job. But what had happened was that H-bombs came in about 1956, 57, and you just put them in on the same targets. And they don't go up by 1,000 times. A lot of the explosion goes up in the air, by the way, so it's not a linear extrapolation of the explosive power. In fact, you get more deaths per bomb by having a number of small bombs going around than you do by one huge bomb. But we put in these huge bombs. That's all we had early on into the pot. How are we doing here? So the figure goes up then. Nobody knowing it, except Eisenhower knew that, and so he thought it was too much. It was overkill. But he didn't change the plan. So that's how you got to these extraordinary figures. And why Soviet Union and China? Well, as I knew, under Eisenhower and later, and I don't know about now, there was no plan for fighting Russia alone, Soviet Union alone, without also hitting China, Sino-Soviet bloc. But after all, by 60 and 61, before I got onto there was no Sino-Soviet bloc. They'd split. That's another long story. But they had split, but the plans stayed the same. So the idea of fighting Soviet Union without also destroying, annihilating China, there was no capability for it. The plans were interwoven. You couldn't just say, okay, not China. There was no way of doing that. The plans were totally intermixed. I mean, an airplane on an alert strip in the Pacific, one of them would be targeted for Vladivostok, and the other next to it would be targeted for China. And they didn't even know which. They had their coordinates. It didn't hardly even show the nationality. That was the concern for minimizing deaths. There was no concern. Maximizing deaths was the idea. Civilian deaths were regarded as, quote, bonus, even if you weren't aiming at that particular city. But if airfield was near the city and destroyed the city as well, that was bonus. And by the way, bring this right up to date, we now have these very precise drones which killed two wrong people, two hostages that they really didn't want to kill, right? Didn't know were there. How many times do you think we know who is there from the drone? How often could they tell you who they'd killed? They'll tell you it was a militant, but then we know that we learned that under Obama, everyone between 14 and 55 male is to be regarded as a militant, quote, unless post-attack intelligence proves otherwise. Post-attack? In other words, we're concerned if they're civilian, if it turns up in the, quote, autopsy, not an actual autopsy on the ground. We're not on the ground. But, you look at it afterwards and you decide who was who. It's not a tremendous concern. But what we also learned today, I just noticed, was two other American citizens that we would have liked to kill, how Obama would have liked to kill, were killed, we found afterwards, without having been targeted. Why did we want to kill them? Because they worked for Al-Qaeda. Very good, we got 2 Al-Qaeda people, but they hadn't been aimed at, and they were American citizens. Now that, I think you would have to say, is not premeditated murder of an American citizen, because he hadn't known what they were. But on the other hand, Anwar al-Awlaki was premeditated, and without jury, prosecution, indictment. He wasn't, by the way, Anwar al-Awlaki was not fleeing justice like Ed Snowden or me for 2 weeks when I was underground from the FBI. Both of us. No, he hadn't been prosecuted, he hadn't been indicted, prosecuted, tried, sentenced, anything. But he was sentenced to death. And then 2 weeks later, his 16-year-old son, also an American citizen, was killed, and they've never explained to this day how that came about. What happened? Okay. I'm saying then that these nuclear weapons exist in a world, and this is not just true of America at all, I'm certain, but they exist in a world, they're run by humans whose concern for other humans who are not us, quote, in the broadest sense. They're not in our alliance, they're not NATO, they're not the same, they may or may not be white, male, whatever, they're not us, don't count at all in our calculations. It's not just that they count less, that's our own self-image. We understand, really, that we humans don't really obey the maximum, love your neighbor as yourself. That's asking a lot. Love your neighbor's children, love other children in the neighborhood as much as you love your own children. That's not exactly human. So we understand we don't care as much. What I've had to confront from my knowledge over the 40 years here, 50 years almost, of war planning is to understand, it's more accurate to understand that people outside a certain circle that isn't too large don't count at all. Not at all. And only if you understand that can you really understand some of the, quote, carelessness or brutality or indifference that exhibits itself, especially in this process of war, but also when it comes to famine or environmental catastrophe. Are we capable of caring about people in the Pacific who are hit by a tsunami? Obviously, yes. An outpouring of support, money, people even go and volunteer. A friend of mine went and volunteered to go to Thailand. And yes, it's possible. If the television focuses on that as a disaster that's not among our enemies, and we may or may not have caused it, but yeah, we are capable of this extreme empathy, unlike other animals, for people we don't know. We are also capable, to a vast degree, of total lack of concern, caring, whatnot, and that's why it's possible to read about these things in the newspaper or see them one night on television, and then go to the commercial, and then go to the other thing. And nothing is done to change the situation. Nothing is done to keep it from happening again. Well, let me tell you now, all this, where we stand now. In 1950, I keep saying this, Szilard, didn't get to it, Szilard conjectured on a University of Chicago roundtable radio program, yes, if the HBomb is feasible, you could salt them, you could give them a coating of cobalt, which would result in a long-lived intense radioactivity that would go around the world and kill everybody. You could kill everybody with enough H-bombs, especially with this cobalt, or possibly without it. And other people said they were dubious about that and did the calculations, is that right? And then the physicists came out and said, well, he was a little bit off in his calculations, but that's true, you can do this. So people talked about a device, I forget whether it was called Doomsday yet or not, that would kill everybody, and worried about that. The movie and the book, first the book, On the Beach, postulates a war with cobalt bombs. And they say, why did they do that? And so it's kind of an interesting discussion in the book. How did this happen? It's not unlike what I've been saying, but actually, no country ever did build what they consciously knew was a cobalt bomb to start with. The British, by the way, experimented a little with it, cobalt tests, just to see. But nobody built a cobalt bomb because why do you want a bomb that's going to kill everybody, including yourself? You know, well, Herman Kahn, my colleague at RAND, so they didn't do that. And they didn't build cobalt, but they didn't otherwise kill everybody. And notice, by the way, what the PSYOP was postulating. It did not kill everybody. What did I say? I said 600 million. I said it was an underestimate. It didn't include the effects of fire. Now, fire is the main effect of a thermonuclear weapon. They said, well, that's hard to calculate. It depends on winds, it depends on kindling. So they didn't, to this day, have never included that at all in their calculations of effects. Lynn Eden of Stanford wrote a whole book on this, The World on Fire, pointing out that you couldn't get them to address this. And she wasn't willing, I think, because of her sources being close in the JCS, she didn't want to say what to me was the obvious reason. If you include that, you don't need as many bombs, you don't need as many planes, you don't need as many missiles, you don't need as much budget. If you get the same effect, if you include fire, you don't need that. So they look at blast and prompt radiation as the immediate thermal, but not the fires of storms that will be created. Now, every thermonuclear weapon will give you a firestorm, every one. So the big beauty there is you don't have to worry about winds and fizzle and tinder and so forth. You get a firestorm every time. Even with an ABomb, by the way, at least at Hiroshima, they got a firestorm. Okay, so they didn't build. What is a billion? Oh, so I'm saying 600 million was an underestimate. A better estimate would be about a billion or billion 2.2, twice as much, if you include the fire and some other stuff. There was at that time 3 billion people in the world only. So that was a third of the population. Now, Edward Teller, I've said numerous times, father of the HBomb, and I have heard him say that in a room, in a hearing that I was debating him. Omnicide is impossible. I can't do a Hungarian accent. At most, you will kill a fourth to a third of the population. Actually, he used to say a fourth. Now, this was a third. He didn't say a fourth to a third. I made that up. A fourth of the population. But actually, the plan was for a third. But that didn't include the U.S., and for good reason. The Joint Chiefs knew better than the president knew at that point. The Russians had 4 ICBMs at one site in Plesetsk. They weren't going to put anything on the U.S., so we got off scot-free. They had, however, hundreds of MRBMs, medium-range missiles, and intermediate-range missiles, and bombers, and tactical bombers, aimed at Germany in particular, but also Europe. So aside from our killing 100 million West Europeans, depending on the weather, they were going to kill 100 million Europeans without regard to the weather. That was in addition to whatever we did. But it's not here. So it's still possible, you know, to say, okay, we get off, the southern hemisphere gets off because the prevailing winds keep the fallout pretty much in the northern hemisphere where the bombs fell. And so it would be a third of the people, two-thirds of the people would be left. As Teller's attitude then, in other words, it's the glass 2/3 full, right? So a lot of people left. I've thought of, since that was so much a calculation of this, I've wanted to have something that was not a term for a plan that envisioned not Doomsday, which no country has ever consciously developed, for obvious reason. But how do you describe a plan that proposes to kill a third of the world's population? Well, I thought of, it's not a Doomsday machine, it's a teller machine. That's what he regarded. It was never called that. But it's a teller machine. In fact, since to a very large extent it's automated, I'm sorry to tell you, but it is an ATM, an automated teller machine. So, hard to find jokes in this subject, but if you call that a joke. Okay, so that's what we had. But it was wrong. What we had was a doomsday machine, and it still is. And still is, right now. Could go off in the next hour from a false alarm on the Russian side, which is a little more likely, or on the US side, which is likely enough. There have been a lot of them. If they happened in a crisis, it would be very dangerous. No one of the false alarms, of which dozens, if not hundreds, depending how you figure, have occurred, they haven't gone on a minute or two longer, which would have triggered the force. So luck, in other words. But if that happened, say our targets are still either on cities or near cities. If we say military targets, we're still talking about command and control inside cities, communications, transportation, air defense, air bases, all the cities go. It kills everybody, pretty much. Because not from radiation, not from fire, or thermal, or blast, or prompt radiation, or fallout, if I said that, but from the smoke from the burning cities. And the fact that we put the cities on fire is not the last word here, the critical word here. The point is they are firestorms which loft the smoke into the stratosphere where it doesn't rain out. And it stays there for what in 20 years ago was finally calculated. All they could calculate was what happened in 1 year and the effects that would have on harvest and sunlight for the next year. Now they have computers 100 times or more powerful, and they're able to say what happens at least for a decade. Can't go much beyond that. The smoke stays there for a decade. And the smoke from a US-Russian exchange, unlike India and Pakistan, if I've said that already, unlike that smoke blots out most sunlight for a decade. And it kills all the harvests, and it kills most growing things. And all the animals that depend on vegetation or on eating other animals that depend on vegetation starve. And that's all of us. Probably not extinction, according to Alan Roebuck and others who've done the main calculations on that, and Turco and a few other ecological, environmental scientists. Humans are so adaptable. It's another of our characteristics, along with compassion and lack of compassion. But we're so adaptable to climate and shelter and finding food wherever, that probably they say a good fair number of people would still survive on islands, fishing, mollusks, as before, parts of the world. It might be 1 million, it might be 10 million, it might be 100 million. But you calculate what 100 million is compared to 7 billion. Nearly everyone dies, not everyone. Of the other vertebrates, they're not that adaptable. They can't move latitudes that many. They die. They all starve. So the birds go, the fish, the animals, the primates, all what my granddaughter would call all the cute animals, everything goes. That's if a fraction of the weapons we have on alert right now on both sides should be triggered either by a false alarm or actual preemption. Somebody goes crazy and starts and the other side goes against them. It doesn't take both sides to do it. One side alone will do it, and it doesn't take the 1,500 weapons we have on alert now. It doesn't, that's what Obama is aiming at. And it doesn't take 1,000, it doesn't take 500. What does it take? Hard to figure, but it's something between 100 and 300 of big weapons. Remember the other, when I think I mentioned Pakistan and India before, the A-bombs. Their weapon, theirs, remember, are the A-bombs, the fission weapons. If they do it against each other's cities, you get 2 billion die. But only the people who have least access to food who are already underfed. 2 billion. That's a third, roughly. They have a teller machine, not a doomsday machine. Possibly all of the other nuclear weapon states, except North Korea, that's the only one that doesn't come near any of this with their 10 weapons at most. They may not have any. They're getting a lot of deterrence. against us with 10 possible weapons. We're not sure they have any weaponized. But the others all are in the area of 100, 150, 200, 300 or more. And that might give you a doomsday. But US and Russia do not have teller machines. They have doomsday machines. And that's where we are. So the emphasis, I would say, by the way, on the feeling that we have of some success, that I don't know whether to call it a success or not, but we have gone down from some 10,000 weapons, and used to be more than that, but in recent years, 10,000 weapons to perhaps 5,000 with only 1,500 on alert. That's gone down, but it has not changed the effect of actually going to war, and the effect is that everybody gets killed. So let me somewhat sum up this part of it. Is it acceptable that India and Pakistan are confronting each other with teller machines? That threatens the poor, undernourished people all over the world. Do they have a right to be starving 2 billion people in their dispute over Kashmir? I would say not. It does seem gratuitous, and odd for an American to complain about India and Pakistan. But everybody in the world has a right to complain about India and Pakistan. But if that's true, and it is, what about, there's also, of course, Israel, China, Russia, UK, France, North Korea, if you like. North Korea, we don't have to worry about it in a way, except that they might sell theirs. That's not good. Okay, but the US and Russia, it has been insane for no less than the mid-50s for these plans to exist. Well, so what is that? That's 50 years, right? So for half a century, it has been unconscionable, outrageous, incredibly awful for the U.S. to possess a doomsday machine in its fights over Cuba and Vietnam and Iraq and Berlin, even Berlin, and West Europe. See? And yet, every nation in Europe has been, until the end of the Cold War, was urging us to continue to make these threats. And those threats were knowable as destroying everywhere. Certainly them. They were totally suicidal for Europe, and that was true from the early 50s. Totally. Poland right now is asking for NATO troops inside Poland, including nuclear weapons. Now, what are they asking exactly? Well, they don't want to be occupied by Russia. That's understandable. So instead of being occupied by Russia, they will threaten, right? That's also understandable. Threaten, it's a bluff, maybe. But it's a bluff that is a real weapon that may actually go off in various ways, and which are going to be very hard to control if actual people start getting killed between Russians and Americans, which has not been a genuine threat since 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'm writing half of a book on that right now. By the way, my publisher I saw 2 days ago said, I've never done this, mention every time, everywhere you go, that what I'm talking about is going to be our book, The American Doomsday Machines, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Okay. Well, I have a lot to say about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I'll just say that came within a hand's breadth of blowing the world up. And there was no one on either side who understood in the slightest that if their plans had been carried out, everybody would die. Be bad, be real bad, everybody understood that. Terrible, they didn't want it. I believe, by the way, I'll give you a bottom line of my analysis, and this is not common sense, this is not everywhere, maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding of the crisis is neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted in the slightest degree to get to armed conflict. They were threatening it, they were preparing it, they were brandishing it, but I believe that each of them was determined that that would not happen. They would give in before they let that happen. But events were out of their control. And the Cubans were doing things to our airplanes, shooting at them, firing, and we're getting closer and closer with every shot, practically. the reconnaissance planes. Had they knocked down another plane, I'm just giving you a bottom line here, almost certainly then the U.S. would have hit all the missiles, the Russians would have replied, we would have been hit with tactical nuclear weapons from Cuba, which we didn't know were there for another 30 years. Did not know they'd had tactical nuclear weapons. The PSYOP would have been used, and we would not be here, very simply. We would not be here. And nobody in the southern hemisphere would be here either. No one knew that. Now we do know it. And we're again talking about first use of nuclear weapons, as Khrushchev was, and can go more into it in the crisis, in the Ukraine. Let's take a look at Iran. If we hit Iran, almost surely that would not lead to all-out war. So the anti-nuclear movements has a number of myths in their head which don't correspond to the reality that the Pentagon lives in. It's not the case that every use of nuclear weapons will inevitably escalate. It's not the use that nuclear weapons any use of them will shortly lead to everybody dying, and so you can't think of using them. No. Most of the threats we've made are against non-nuclear states, like Vietnam, or Korea, or at the time China, and so forth. And actually, that would not have led the Soviets to respond, almost certainly. Could that war have been won by that massacre, that mass murder? Yeah. So it's wrong to say a nuclear war can't be won if it's one-sided. But a two-sided nuclear war, even between India and Pakistan, we now know it doesn't just kill 100 million Indians and Pakistanis. It kills 2 billion people. And a war between the U.S. and Russia that came out of the Ukraine, which both sides are talking about, are brandishing, are threatening, could in fact lead to threats being carried out eventually, once those people start dying on both sides. Because are our military, are the civilians on both sides perfectly clear that that absolutely must not happen? That they use a nuclear weapon? That the weapons they have and have trained with and bought and paid for and have planned and have been ordered to use on command, do they have it clearly in their head that that order must not be carried out? It's totally a bluff, guys. No, actually, that's not the way they're trained at all on either side. So it really is important, A, that shooting not get started between the U.S. and Russia. Let's say if ISIS had nuclear weapons. Horrible. That would be horrible. If ISIS had nuclear weapons, you should not be fighting ISIS. Actually, sorry to say that. But they don't. Okay, great. So we can fight ISIS, and we can have another Vietnam. And it would be just as successful as the Russians were in Afghanistan and we were in Vietnam. And if you enjoyed that, if you want that again, we can do that again. I'm saying, in other words, that some conflicts are more dangerous than others. And the one we are edging toward are two of them. If we went against Iran, for example, that wouldn't lead immediately. Who is going to use nuclear weapons against us if we did that? As Cheney wanted to do with nuclear weapons. And even Bush recoiled from that, turns out. There's a new book on that subject. I've always guessed that Cheney was overruled on that, and a new book comes out and says, yes, they split on that issue. George W. Bush said, no, too much. All right, it wouldn't have blown the world up. But if Israel or the U.S. did that right now with conventional or nuclear weapons, all the experts, of which I'm not one, agree that assures that Iran gets a nuclear weapon very soon. Assures it. You don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon? I don't. But attack Iran, they'll get a nuclear weapon. And they can do it. And if Iran gets it, then the administration and Netanyahu is right on this point, the following point. If they get it, then Egypt will get it, and Saudi Arabia will get it, and Syria, and so forth. That's true. Not good. So we shouldn't attack Iran. I believe, by the way, I yield to almost no one in my criticism of the president I voted for twice, Barack Obama. Let me be fair, I be honest. I didn't vote for Barack the second time. He didn't need my vote. I was in California. So I voted for Cindy Sheehan, as a matter of fact. But if I'd been in Wisconsin or Florida or somewhere, I would have voted for Barack Obama, absolutely. Because I believed that Romney or earlier McCain, or for that matter Hillary Clinton, had been president, we would have been fighting Iran for some years now. And we would. And I was hoping that Barack Obama was less likely to do that than they were. And on that one point, I think I'm vindicated on that point. My third-party friends were very furious with me, and I lost some friends. But I said, he's less likely to bomb. That would be very bad. To say there's no difference between these people is, in my view, mistaken. But is there enough difference? That's the question. And what we're doing, and are we going in the end to arm the Western Ukrainians and then back them up with military force? Well, Obama is dragging his heels on that, thank God, I would say. But can I be sure that in the next year that won't happen? No. And by the way, do I think that Putin, who I believe, by the way, is not the demon that he is demonized as now, he is not Hitler Redux. I think that's absurd. And the idea that he's going to reconstitute the entire Warsaw Pact, right, or even the USSR with Ukraine, I think is not true at all. But do I think that Putin is going to do what he says he won't do, which is to allow Eastern Ukraine to be part of NATO and anti-Russian alliance, military alliance? I don't think so. Well, how is he going to stop it? Well, with a lot of conventional weapons, right? And so NATO uses conventional weapons to back up what they regard as the legitimate government of all of Ukraine, installed by a coup in Kiev. They're prepared, in other words, to fight him on this issue, not just for Western Ukraine, but for all of Ukraine. I think Putin is one more world leader who's prepared to take steps that will, in fact, blow the world up, rather than let Eastern Ukraine be part of NATO. Now, you either start with that. If I'm right, you shouldn't be doing, what our policy is talking about. It should be on a different basis somehow. And I'm not giving Putin credit for this or admiring him or anything. I'm saying that's just the way it is. Just as we had every preparation and everybody in NATO to blow the world up. No, we thought it was only the Northern Hemisphere, excluding the U.S., if Berlin access was stopped. That was the plans when I was in the Pentagon. As Mort Halpern put it, first we probe with conventional forces, with a brigade. If they stop that, we send in a division. If we stop that, we use a demonstration nuclear weapon. And if they reply to that, we blow up the world. And now I'm saying to you more precisely, in those days, they didn't see it as blowing up the world. Only Eurasia. Not the U.S., not the Southern Hemisphere. And they were wrong. Their scientists hadn't told them what the effect of the smoke would be, and they hadn't asked, and they still haven't. And the president has still, as far as I know, and I know as much as I've been able to, no president has asked the Pentagon, what will the effects be of carrying out our current war plans in terms of smoke and the effect on the environment? I'm doing everything I can think of in my life to get Obama to ask that question, but I have no indication that it has any chance of getting through to him at any point. It's another whole story. So I'm saying, what does this mean? Well, I think we can, here are some final thoughts for the anti-nuclear movement. Instead of focusing only on numbers of weapons, getting them down, without really asking, and how far down do they have to get, and how fast, and how acceptable is what's happening, and so forth. Instead of just asking, are we going down or not, and we're not at the moment. And instead of saying, let's talk about zero, and I do talk about zero, and I am for zero. But it's not just that they're not going to zero, they're not going down. And they're continuing to make first-use threats. So one focus that's never been the focus of the anti-war movement, of the anti-nuclear movement is first-use threats on either side are absolutely unconscionable, of any kind. It should not be the case that almost unchallenged, every major political candidate in 2008 said, with respect to Iran, all options are on the table. And when George W. Bush was asked by a reporter, "Sir, does that mean the nuclear option?" he said, you can see this on YouTube, by the way, just look it up, it's easy. "I said all options are on the table." Echoed by every major candidate, including Hillary and Barack Obama, and every Republican except Ron Paul, who said, by the way, on the Democrat side, I should say my candidate, Dennis Kucinich, did not say that. And even Edwards, who turned out to be a horse's ass, but Edwards I thought was pretty good, and he was against that. But they were both, of course, in the 1% category, as was Ron Paul. So those are the people who were against it. And Ron Paul said to the Republicans who were lined up next to him, "What are you saying? That's terrible. What do you mean, using nuclear weapons against Iran?" He was the only one at his 1% level. And by the way, I doubt it'll be interesting to hear if we hear anything like that from Rand Paul this time. Maybe 2 years ago we might have. I don't know about this year. It's outrageous that they should be talking about threatening and initiating nuclear war in these circumstances. When Barack Obama, fighting Hillary Clinton for the nomination at the time, said in this thing, he was asked, "Would you use nuclear weapons against Pakistan?" Pakistan, an ally with nuclear weapons. And he said, "No, I would not consider that." And the story, the report is that people who were watching Hillary Clinton watch that on television saw a smile on her face. She had him on this one. And she lost no time in saying, a president should never say what options he will or will not use. See? It's wrong to say, "I won't use nuclear weapons against Pakistan." How about against Grenada? Would that be wrong? No, don't. And so forth. But they're willing to say against Iran, which will send them into underground efforts now to build nuclear weapons or to buy them anything, and definitely willing to say first use against Russia in the case of Ukraine, and Russia is now saying the same, and they never did that before. And why did they never do it before? Because when there was any question of a conflict with the U.S. before, in Europe, they had the conventional superiority. Now they don't. And they don't have the Warsaw Pact anymore. So now they're where we were with respect to Berlin. We couldn't defend Berlin with conventional weapons. So now they're in eastern Ukraine, and they can do quite a bit in eastern Ukraine unless NATO troops come in. And they ain't going to let go of eastern Ukraine, in my inexpert judgment, but judging by Steve Cohen and Juan Cole and other people who know a lot more. Okay. So I don't think these are total bluffs. The anti-nuclear movement could be saying, as I believe, by the way, Peter Weiss's group, here I just got it out there, maybe it is Iolana, had a collection of things that we should focus on, and one of them I liked all of them actually, and one of them was very unusual, and that said we should be condemning and protesting any threat of use of nuclear weapons. Absolutely. It is not the case that all these threats are bluffs or have no effect on events. Not true. We should not allow people unchallenged, without the greatest challenge, of talking about initiating nuclear war under any circumstances, and above all against Russia, above all. And second, they even had a really new one that I'd never seen before, very good. It's one of the papers out there. We should be saying no more exercises using nuclear weapons. Both sides have been doing that within the last few months. Both sides have exercised using nuclear weapons. And the Russians, in one case, as I say, dropping a weapon on Warsaw. That's outrageous. It's unexcusable. And it's not just the U.S., the superpower, who should feel that, or NATO, or whoever. NATO makes the same kind of threats. Every nation in the world has a right to protest that. Say, a weapon on Warsaw? That kills everybody. That one does escalate. And when it escalates, It kills us down in the, not just in the Marshall Islands. Well, the Marshall Islands might be the last to live. They're an island with fish. Great. Everybody else. Okay, so that's a different focus from what we've had. And I'm saying no doomsday machines. And what that means is, by the way, stop talking about 1,500 warheads on alert. Stop talking about de-alerting. Stop talking about 1,000 or 500. At a very minimum, your studies should show that you cannot create doomsday. That gets you down into the low hundreds, which is an interesting figure because that's where India and Pakistan and Britain and France and Israel, that's where they are. Oh, can we be down to their level? Well, if you don't, you've got a doomsday machine. And you have no need for a doomsday machine and no right to have a doomsday machine. You never have had, and you've always had it. So it's got to stop. You've got to get rid of that. And that means, yes, you do go down right away to the level of those other countries. And then, together, we have a prospect for delegitimizing nuclear weapons that we can't all around the zero that so many of us are interested in. You have a basis for doing that, which is impossible when the U.S. is threatening first use of nuclear weapons, and Russia for that matter, and both of us intend to have thousands forever. That means anti-proliferation efforts are ridiculous. They're not in the cards. So we should put them into the cards, including going towards zero by getting down immediately to the level of the other nuclear powers and then going down with them further. That's a suggestion by me. And I think it's compatible with most people here. And some would say, well, you're not focusing only on zero. And I'm saying, yeah, that's right. I absolutely believe in focusing on zero. I am for that. I have been for years. It is not the only thing we should be talking about. And we have desperate need to change this posture in other ways fast. Okay, thank you. I used up. Yeah, we have another 15 minutes, sir. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Oh, really?
I wanted to ask you to talk about the role of deterrence. The role of deterrence with nuclear weapons. Is it possible to, if there are no nuclear weapons, what is going to be the role of deterrence replaced by?
Very interesting question. I was just writing to myself on that question today because, this isn't, as you can see, an older audience. We don't have the youth with us. I was asking myself this morning, why not? There are a lot of reasons. There's not a youth movement for various reasons that there used to be, except for Occupy. And but another is that since the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was 1962, and since the test ban in the atmosphere in 63, and it goes way back, certainly since the end of the Cold War, young people have lived their lives never having heard about big nuclear war. Possible, right? When has it ever come up? Don't see it in television, newspapers, and certainly not on Twitter. So what does nuclear war mean to them? It's not as though they never heard the word nuclear. Rogue nations like Iran or North Korea or Iraq, maybe, right? Possible. We've got to keep them from doing it, which means we have to be prepared to hit them first. Looks legitimate to people. Or a terrorist attack, which is possible. And indeed, I'll just mention, somebody asked me the other day, Iran was having a big argument on Iran, and he was saying Iran would give it to Hamas, which they support, Hamas. I said, in my judgment, the chance of that is 0, 0, 0. There is no chance that Iran would give a bomb to Hamas. They have, first of all, no nuclear state has, in the world. Even Iraq has not given an actual nuclear weapon to anybody. And second, Iran, for very good reasons, doesn't give Hamas even their more advanced weapons. They've kept them down at a very low level for reasons. They don't want that out of their control. They don't want the thing to escalate. But notice what I've just said about the rogue nations and the terrorist nations. They are understood to be undeterrable, right? Now, that's very exaggerated if you're talking about a nation. We said Saddam Hussein was undeterrable, right? That's why we had to hit him first. Actually, Saddam was the one head of state in the world who had been subject to 2 fits of bombing when he had weapons of mass destruction, not nuclear, but biological and chemical, he really did have, and he was deterred from using them. He didn't use them under that bombing. He's the only head of state who had actually been tested on that one. So he was deterrable. And Iran, of course, is deterrable. And they worry about Israel. Existence and so forth. And they say with its nuclear weapons, yes, Iran could commit suicide anytime they want, but they don't need nuclear weapons for that. Biological weapons or chemical weapons will do the job, and every Iranian will be destroyed by Israeli nuclear weapons. So, yeah, but what if they're not deterrable? What if they're mad? Well, the question you raise is, to the extent that young people have heard about this problem, they've only heard about undeterrables. Now, why then are we building new Trident submarines and, a new generation of Minuteman and new bombers and so forth against who? Terrorists? They're not exactly new against terrorists. The reality is that the possibility of big nuclear war has always been there, and it is there now more than before. Is it a good thing to do to be building up our doomsday machine in the past? Was that a good idea in the first place? No, it wasn't a good idea then, and it's not a good idea now. So the answer, I'd say to your question, first of all, is the idea of deterrence has never needed a doomsday machine, and that's what they built inadvertently, and they should get rid of it. They should never have had it. Russia should never have had it. They do have it. Both of them should get rid of it, and even if Russia doesn't, we should get rid of it. Even the doomsday machine, okay? If you're down, North Korea, as I said earlier, gets a lot of deterrence from their 10 possible weapons. 10 compared to our 5,000 thermonuclear weapons. So even without going to zero, where deterrence does matter, and it can matter, it does matter, I could go into that. People who say deterrence is so incredible it could never have had any effect. No, I would say not, because it's a long answer, but an important question. Did it have any effect? I'll give you an effect. We stayed in Berlin from beginning to end without threatening first use of nuclear weapons throughout that period. And I'm not saying we should have done this, that it was wise, necessary, prudent. It was necessary in one sense. You couldn't rearm West Germany and keep Berlin 200 miles inside East Germany without threatening nuclear weapons. And we did threaten nuclear weapons, and it kept them out. Now you could say, is that worth a risk of blowing up Eurasia? The answer to these people would say, well, how big a risk? The answer is, they said, well, 1 in 1,000, maybe all right. What is an acceptable risk of a doomsday machine going off? Is 1 in 1,000 acceptable? 1 in 100? What is the possible? I would say anything other than 0 is unacceptable. But as I said, they weren't looking at a doomsday machine. They were just looking, the U.S. would come out scot-free. So, and Europe, why should Europe accept that? Well, if that's the case, then Russia will be deterred. So we can live with that, see? Except it wasn't necessary. So who else has deterred attack? China, Soviet Union, North Korea, North Korea looks, and other countries look, and Iran is undoubtedly looking at Iraq now and Afghanistan. They said, if they had nuclear weapons, they wouldn't have had the attack that they did have, and that's true. So these other countries, unfortunately, have a first-use reason for deterrence, what Herman Kahn used to call type 2 deterrence. If type 1, this distinction is very important. We're led to believe that nuclear weapons are only for one real purpose, to deter nuclear attack. Or at best, that's the only legitimate reason. That has never been the main reason for U.S. nuclear weapons or anyone else's. The main reason has always been to deter or to threaten conventional attack by the threat of first use, of initiating nuclear war. That was true in Europe. It was true for everybody, essentially. And when the Russians finally got some nuclear weapons, then we did have to deter nuclear attack possibly too, but it was never the main reason, and it never required 20,000 weapons, ever, see? It wasn't for that. So first use has always been, as some of you heard me say earlier today, just a handful, we have used our nuclear weapons dozens, and that's plural, dozens of times since Nagasaki, secretly. The way you use a pistol when you point it at someone's head in a confrontation, you are using the pistol whether or not the trigger is pulled, and if you get your way without pulling the trigger, that's the best use, and that's why you have them, and that's why you keep them. So the anti-nuclear movement, I think, has, to a large extent, I'm going to say critically here, has never faced up to what is the main purpose of the weapons that they're opposing. And they will say, overkill, don't we have more than we need to deter nuclear attack? Yes, but that's not what they're for. We don't have more than we need to threaten Russia with a use against them, or you can't have too many, or to, they say, or to use first use against a Russian ally, like North Vietnam or China in the Taiwan Straits and so forth. If you're going to threaten them, you want to keep the Russians from replying. And for those, you want to be able to disarm Russia so as to have a credible threat. That's what the way it's been and the way it is now. And I could go on. I won't say more on that. But that Type 2 deterrence has always been the major kind of deterrence, and it's what keeps them in Israel now. Is Israel threatened with nuclear attack? No, they aren't. In fact, they risked encouraging other countries to get them. And amazingly, against my own prediction, other countries haven't yet risen to that. They haven't made them. They say they'll go against Iran, but they won't. They haven't done it for Israel for some reason. But the threat is against Middle Eastern attack. And Vanunu, by the way, went to prison for 11 and a half years, 18 years, 11 and a half in solitary confinement. And in his mind was the thought to show that Israel was so loaded with nuclear weapons, they didn't need the West Bank or the Golan Heights. He didn't say that explicitly. He just wanted to come out and say, why are you saying for security you need this stuff? Your plans call for first use. And the Egyptians know that, and the Jordanians know that, and they ain't going to replay 73. That hasn't even come up. Okay, well, long story. I'll come back to you. Just a second.
Saddam Hussein did use weapons of mass destruction primarily against his own people and against the Iranians. And Saddam Hussein did use weapons of mass destruction against his own people and the Iranian Saddam, using mostly components supplied by the Reagan administration. So there was a point in time when we didn't object to his use of weapons of mass destruction. Two questions. One is, I know of at least one nuclear state that has given up its nuclear weapons. That was South Africa before the fall of apartheid. And I'm wondering if there's any lessons there for us. And then you mentioned Barack Obama. We're facing a new presidential election next year. I'm wondering if you have any advice for us in terms of our choices next year.
Start with the easy one last. I don't want a Republican to get in, and people who say there's literally no difference between the parties are, as far as I'm concerned, talking through their hat. Their judgment is not very good. There isn't as much difference as they claim or as there should be. There's a lot of things where there's no difference. I don't know of a single area where the Republicans would actually be better. I'm open to hearing that, if somebody can come up with it. But, and I don't say, by the way, that Barack Obama was better on civil liberties, for example. In my area, whistleblowing here, he's prosecuted 3 times as many people as all previous presidents put together, including George W. Bush, so it's not as though he's always better. In fact, in that case, he's worse than his predecessors, Republicans, but not worse than his successors, whether they're Democrat or Republican. Either Hillary Clinton or whoever else. Do we have a track 2 on that one? Or any Republican will be as bad or worse from now I believe that what we're going to get, whoever, and that includes, as of now, Hillary, there's a real danger of war with Iran, I believe. Certainly very high with the Republicans. Horrible. And I am hoping very much that Obama will get as much headway as he can while he's still in office on Iran, even though the Republicans have promised to overturn that, even in Congress, but certainly in the White House. So that, to me, is a sufficient reason to be very much against the Republican getting in. And I have to say, and this will isolate me from some people in this audience, I'm sure, that means to me that a third-party candidacy in close states increases the chances of war with Iran, in my opinion. So I'm against that. I love Bernie Sanders. I'd be very happy to have him fight in the primaries. I wouldn't even mind his running as an independent in California and Texas and so forth. And I would be very much against his running like Nader in Florida or elsewhere. Okay, but going back now to your other, some of your other points. You mentioned, and I didn't hear it all, I have to say, my hearing being so bad, but you mentioned, by the way, Saddam's use of poison gas on his own people. Quite right. And I wasn't sure of the point you're making, but I will make this historical observation. That was at a time when we were very close to Saddam. It was after he used them on his own people, quote, his own people, the Kurds. That was like, as Noam Chomsky pointing out, that's like saying that Andy Jackson killed a lot of his own people, the Cherokee. So he used them against the Kurds at a time when we were so close to him that Rumsfeld was going over, shaking hands and having champagne, and giving him aid after that gassing. And to explain that, we blamed the gassing on, the Iranians. That was a lie. It was Saddam. But since Saddam was on our side then, we blamed it on the Iranians, having encouraged Saddam to attack the Iranians. And one of the great war crime atrocities of the century, regularly to encourage that war in which 1 million people died, and I could name some others. So should we trust Saddam? Remember, the Kurds he used it on didn't have nuclear weapons. He didn't use it on us. So the Kurds didn't deter him. Interestingly, I'll tell you one piece of history that is very significant, really. As Scott Ritter brought out at the time as the head of the inspectors for the UN in the Senate room, Saddam had prepared Scud missiles armed with nerve gas. We weren't sure that he had weaponized nerve gas for missiles, but he had, and he did. And he had Scud missiles poised at Tel Aviv to be fired under very reliable subordinates of his if he were killed. Now, interestingly, he didn't tell us that, like Dr. Strangelove, But what is the purpose of this, If you don't tell, the whole purpose is that he didn't tell. There's a lot of other examples of that I could give. So he didn't tell, he didn't deter us, and so we were doing everything possible to kill Saddam Hussein. And some of you remember, I think it was called the Habaniya civilian shelter, where we used penetrating weapons to go down in the thought that Saddam might be there. And he wasn't there, it just killed a lot of civilians. We were doing everything we could to kill Saddam. And had we done so, they would have fired these weapons against Tel Aviv. And the Israeli forces had told Scott Cy Hirsch, my friend, reporter, that nerve gas on Tel Aviv meant nuclear weapon on Baghdad. So that's the way the world goes. And I'm saying, so should we trust Saddam Hussein with nuclear weapons? I didn't mean to suggest that, by the way. I'm saying not more or less than any of these other nuclear weapons states. And you don't have to be a nut, a fanatic, a torturer, or anything else in charge of these things to be a danger. And all these people are dangerous, including Barack Obama, and some would be more dangerous than Barack, which we shouldn't elect, in my opinion. Yeah.
John Steinbach, Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee of the National Capital Area. So I think one of my concerns, Dan, is not just the crisis, the confrontation in Ukraine, but it's the degree of demonization that's been taking place vis-a-vis Russia in the last few months. I count at least 4 TV shows now that have an anti-Russian theme. A number of movies have come up, creating the new evil empire. And I'm wondering to what degree this is playing into the dynamic, to what degree all of this is lowering the threshold to nuclear war, and should our friends at the Bulletin be thinking about resetting the clock?
I couldn't agree more, and you're absolutely right. Even my friends, people around the associates and so forth, have absorbed the almost not all of them, the almost unanimous demonization of Russia here. But even Putin, what about Putin and so forth? I don't have any impression that Putin is a good guy. He's a murderer, and he's an aspiring dictator pretty much. His civil liberties are terrible. Ed Snowden would not be in Russia if we'd let him be anywhere else. And he can't say that, but I'll say it. And as far as I can see, Putin is not much better and not worse than any of the other world leaders I see on the scene. And I don't think there's one of them who wouldn't be doing pretty much what Putin has been doing. I don't say in the dictatorial aspect. That's another matter. But in terms of foreign policy, which one of them would let a warm water port like Crimea suddenly, by virtue of a coup inspired by Western powers in Kiev against a corrupt but elected government in Kiev, and with the aid of not neo-Nazi but old Nazi factions in Ukraine, people who were fascist before Hitler was in some cases, as part of the government, not the whole government the way Putin says, just part of it. And which one then would let that port of Crimea go into the hands of an armed anti-Russian alliance on their own? In other words, no leader of Russia was more likely to allow that to happen than we were going to let Berlin go, and for similar diplomatic reasons. That's what I'm saying about Eastern Ukraine. Hell, we regarded Cuba as part of the U.S. We did not accept the legitimacy of the Castro regime from day one. And in 1962, Kennedy was secretly preparing the covert operations leading up to an invasion of Cuba. But why? Because Cuba is our Eastern Ukraine. Cuba is part of us, just like Panama. Did I say just like Panama? Yeah, just like Panama. It's part of the U.S. Wandering around here, but I was in China once in 1995, and students asked me what did I think about Tibet? Very touchy subject, and I didn't want to get in too deep waters here. And I said, well, I know that all Chinese regard Tibet as absolutely part of China, and I just want to tell you that my impression is that the rest of the world doesn't entirely see it that way. But they act, as though it's the way we act on Panama, essentially. And we ain't going to let somebody defiant to us get hold of Panama. Okay, so what we're left with then is, as Putin keeps saying, don't you think we have interests? Well, what that means is don't you accept that we have a sphere around us, that we care who our immediate neighbors are? That's what we're saying. And we say, as we've always said, oh no, we don't accept that. That's not the UN Charter. We don't accept spheres of influence. Central America, yes, but as Stimson said, I believe, it's Cordell Hull. Surely the Europeans will not mind our little sphere over here, right, and so forth, around the world. Well, the truth is, all these countries do care about who their immediate neighbors are. They're not indifferent to that any more than we would be indifferent to the kind of country in Mexico or Canada, and passive with respect to it. So to pretend that the world is such that they have no right to be concerned, and to take action, is not to live in the world we live in. But how does the world have to change? I remember back in 1965 when Paul Potter of SDS had a rally that I was at because my later-to-be wife brought me to it. I was in the Pentagon, but she was going to this anti-war rally, which I was very nervous about attending. And and I heard Paul Potter, I think it was the SDS, says, "What is this system that is conducting this war? What name should we give it?" And he didn't actually give an answer to that. And others implied in SDS later that the name should have been either liberalism, and it was a liberal government that was involved. Is that the whole problem? Or another would have said, and today I heard several people, Zia Mian, I believe, my friend, close friend, said capitalism. Well, actually, you've heard me say, not all the countries who've created this problem are capitalists. I suppose Russia is now, and in a certain sense, and China is now, even though the Communist Party, but they didn't used to be, and they were definitely part of the problem before. I think the word imperialism is a good word to keep up in the air. That imperialism by anybody, wherever you see imperialism. Some people say, well, there's better imperialism and worse, and that may be. But all imperialism is against the will of the local people that you're governing, against their consent, or it wouldn't be an empire, it would be a commonwealth. And that means torture, secret police, massacre, surveillance, for all of them. That means the US and Britain and France and England and Russia and China and everywhere else you could look. When you see imperialism, you're seeing something at the very best problematic that needs looking very closely at, and something I think that deserves to be called imperialism. And the US absolutely is in that order, but not alone. Leftists were very reluctant to call what the position of the Soviets in the Warsaw Pact imperial. Anybody with a Marxist background didn't like to call that imperial. Any definition of imperial you want to make has to include that, of their position in East Germany and Poland, Romania, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And our operations in Guatemala, in Chile, in Indonesia, I go around the world, our imperial operations. They used to be what I called, I think my term, covert empire, where we operated a great deal by plausible denial, hiding our hand, working through proxies. And now the difference is, with the Cold War over, it's not so covert anymore. Assassination by the US and torture used to be covert. Now it isn't. And Nixon sent 12 people with orders to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg totally on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd, 1972, up from Florida. And when the prosecutor told me that, I said, what does that mean? Kill me? And he says, the words were, incapacitate you totally. Came from the Oval Office through Hunt and Liddy to 12 Cuban CIA assets. And he said, but you have to understand, these guys never used the word kill. Well, I don't know what word Barack Obama now, but he leaked. The Republicans blamed him for leaking, to make himself look tough, the fact that he had a Tuesday meetings, where he looked on a list of people to be killed, some of whom were Americans. That's not what you call covert, and it's not what you call legal, but it seems we've changed in that way. And what it is imperial. Very old stuff as imperial, and it doesn't look good. Last question. Dad? People are coming in from other
groups. Dan Ellsberg, I do have a question, but before I do, I just would like to say thank you so much for reminding us that there is so much more to talk about besides zero. You're for zero, I'm for zero, but no nuclear threats, no nuclear exercises, maybe even no first use. Those are all things that can happen before zero, and you've been so compelling on making that point to us, Dan. And I guess, people say this, people say this to soldiers all.
I love hearing this from Tad Daly, whom I don't know very well except by email and phone. But what's the name of your book?
You're very kind, Dan. No. It's called Apocalypse Never.
Okay, terrific book, Apocalypse Never. He hoped it would be the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the movement that would end nuclear weapons. It should have been. It would be a good book for it. Read it.
Thank you for that as well, Dan. Yes, apocalypse never. Forging the path to a nuclear weapon-free world. I was just going to finish my comment, though, Dan, by saying, you know, people say this to soldiers all the time, but I would like to say for you, to you, for today and for so much more over the years, thank you for your service. Not just to your country, Dan Ellsberg, to humanity. So thank you so much. I do have a question now. You have made this point. Twice you uttered this very provocative sentence, quote, I listened very closely, North Korea gets an awful lot of deterrence out of 10 possible nuclear weapons. And that is so important to recognize. This point was made incredibly vividly by something that just got almost no attention. It was a week after we started bombing Libya. And we opened that by dropping a bomb on Gaddafi's house, just like you were talking about Saddam Hussein. And Kim Jong-il, who was still alive then, he said, you know, if Gaddafi had kept his nuclear weapons program and acquired a nuclear deterrent, this would not be happening to them. And that's why we're never going to get rid of ours. And that, it seems to me, is going to be a very difficult long-term obstacle to getting to zero, to getting to abolition. It just makes so much sense for a small, weak state like North Korea to have a small nuclear deterrent to defend themselves against the mighty power, the United States in their case, but other examples like Pakistan against India, like Russia against us today. So how do we confront that that incredible incentive that weak states have to acquire and keep a nuclear deterrent?
Thank you, Ted. And people are coming in now, so I'll have to end. I'll say that when people say nuclear weapons are of no use, no legitimacy, can't succeed, can't do anything, they're wrong. As I say, like North Korea, they were very close to being attacked either with conventional or nuclear weapons, if necessary, in 1994. And that was under Bill Clinton. And that they moved away from that in a negotiation, which was a good negotiation that Carter, ex-president, was involved in. They went through. Bush drew away from that, focused on other things. They acquired the nuclear weapons. They're not subject to the same degree of threat. And is this a good regime? No, as we all know, one of the worst in the world. And is it legitimate for them to protect themselves? They're doing the same way, everybody else has done it. And it does work. So it'll be hard to get. But for the aims the U.S. has proclaimed, the deterrence of nuclear attack on us, we have never needed 1/100th of the nuclear weapons we had, ever. That was always a hoax. We do not need any. We do not need them now. And we do not need first use, except for the imperial needs, which, again, are rather covert most of the time. But if we were to oppose that determination that we get to decide who does what in the world, that would be a major change in our society, and not only in our elites. It would change our society and the military-industrial complex. Very big, very hard to bring about. But those of us who can conceive of a nuclear weapons-free world as a meaningful, practical objective should be able to conceive of a world without empire as well. Okay, thank you. In fact, if you don't get the latter, you won't get the former. With the empires, you will not get rid of nuclear weapons.